Sunday afternoon. Have you all been doing loads of festival stuff? Yeah, so basically you're all festivaled out, aren't you? Yeah. But you know what, if we can't have fun this afternoon, we're in trouble, really, if we can't enjoy the next hour and have a few laughs and have a bit of fun, which I know we are going to do. My name's Peg Alexander. I'm the host of this session. I'm a local journalist, reporter, presenter, been around the Literature Festival since it started, right back in its early days. And I do loads of this kind of thing. But I think one of the reasons as well I've been asked to do this is that I actually, many years ago, trained to be a fashion designer, and I went to Britain's top fashion college. Unbelievably, I don't know how I got in, but somehow I did. And also recently, I made a podcast for the RSA, the Royal Society of Arts and Manufacturing, all about the concept of circular economy and the fashion industry and basing it in Leeds. So I made a podcast all about the fact that Leeds changed the face of the world when it came to the high street and fashion. Could they do it again? But this time sustainably. So if anybody wants to check that out, that is sitting somewhere in the online ether. But back to the next hour, because we're going to have a fantastic time here. We're going to step into the vibrant world of LGBTQ plus fashion. We're going to take a captivating journey through its rich and diverse history, from androgynous styles of the 1920s to the bold statements of the Stonewall era and beyond. We're going to uncover the evolution of LGBTQ plus fashion as a form of self-expression, resistance, and identity. And we've got three fantastic guests who are going to help us do that. So let me introduce our guests and our speakers. First up, Eleanor. Hello, Eleanor. Eleanor Medhurst, welcome to Bradford. This is your first time in Bradford, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's so exciting to be here.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for coming. Let me introduce you. You're an independent fashion historian, and you're the author of Unsuitable, A History of Lesbian Fashion, which we have a copy of here, as well as the online blog Dressing Dykes. Now, you studied fashion design and fashion history at the University of Brighton.
Yes.
You've worked towards the sharing of queer histories throughout your involvement with Queer Looks and Queer the Peer exhibitions at Brighton Museum.
Yeah.
And you live in Birmingham with your wife.
Yeah.
Well, welcome to Bradford. I know you just travelled up from Brum this morning. It's fantastic to have you here. Thank you. We also... brilliant. Yay. We also have Paul Burston with us. Paul, who clearly is an icon. Totally. Fantastic. Keep the applause coming, because that's so lovely. Paul, you're the curator and host of the award-winning LGBTQ plus literary salon Polari, and the founder of the Polari Prize Book, which gives awards every year to LGBTQ plus writers. 2016, you featured in the British Council's global list of 33 visionary people promoting freedom, equality, and LGBT rights around the world. How fantastic is that?
I don't know how that happened.
Wow, that is just amazing. You're also the author of 6 novels, 5 non-fiction books, an editor of 2 short story collections, and your memoir, of which we have a copy here, We Can Be Heroes, A Survivor's Story, it talks the tale of living through 2 pandemics, of course, the AIDS pandemic, and more recently the COVID pandemic, and much more. And there is going to be a Polari Literary Salon tonight, 6:30 at the Playhouse.
There is.
As well. Brilliant. So we're looking forward to your input into this. Thank you, Paul. Let's have a round of applause for Paul. And we also have the fantastic Joelle Taylor with us. You've been doing quite a lot this festival, haven't you, Joelle?
Quite a bit, yeah. I did my full show yesterday, and then I've just done Poets for Palestine in the St George's Hall.
Yeah, isn't the St George's Hall just fantastic?
It's incredible,
as well?
isn't it?
Do you know what? There's so much history of the St George's Hall. That's one of the first places where the Independent Labour Party, which went on to become the Labour Party, held its first rallies under Keir Hardie. So you were actually in the venue where actually what's happened in the last week kind of started off. It's also where a load of suffragettes hid under the stage.
Sick.
And they disrupted a major rally with, I think, Herbert Asquith. But anyway, we can check that out. Right, going back to you. You're the author of 4 collections of poetry and a novel. Your most recent collection, Cunto and Other Poems, won the 2021 T.S. Eliot Prize and was the subject of a Radio 4 Arts documentary called Butch. And Cunto has currently been adapted for theatre with a view for touring. I mean, you've spoken all over the world, you've performed all over the world, and you're also a former UK slam champion. You founded the National Youth Poetry Slam Ambassadors.
I did.
Yeah.
You tell I'm gay because of the name, isn't it? What do you want to call the National Youth Slam Ambassadors?
Slam Ambassadors. You're also the 2022 Saboteur Spoken Word Artist of the Year. And at the festival, you've been talking about your debut novel, which isn't the poetry, it's a debut novel, The Night Alphabet, as well. It's fantastic to have you here. Thank you very much. So, I know Joelle's going to do some poetry for us. Paul, as well, you're going to do a bit of a reading from your book when we get to appropriate points in the conversation. But Eleanor, I'm going to start with you, if that's all right, as our fashion historian, our fashion expert on the panel. So your book, Unsuitable, it's a really fascinating historical look, mainly at fashion kind of 20th century and onwards, but also you go back quite a bit further. You go right back to Sappho, who we think was kind of like the first recorded lesbian back in 630 BC. And obviously it's all about fashion. So tell us a bit, how has lesbian fashion been different to, if you like, just other fashion or general fashion over this time?
Well, fashion is such an interesting way to look at kind of social histories and histories of any marginalized community in particular. And I come from a fashion history background, and I'm also a lesbian, you might not have guessed. And the two kind of combined into me wanting to research and find out about the history of lesbian fashion specifically. There's not much out there on that as a topic, just because lesbians in history so often, especially when it comes to things like clothing and the study of why clothes are important, that's not something that's typically been recorded or talked about. And a lot of that is because of histories and stories not being valued and communities not having to hide from one another in specific social contexts. So,
and of course, most history anyway really just records the experience of men, doesn't it? Of white men. That is a problem generally.
For sure.
With history. I mean, you describe it in your book as that the lesbian past is slippery, which I thought is an interesting word there, because you say it's often hidden, edited, or unrecorded.
Yeah, definitely. And it's like the ways that like trends in lesbian fashion haven't been able to progress and develop in the way that they do in mainstream fashion, just because they haven't had that kind of same platform, essentially.
I mean, we're going to get into some of what those trends are, and there's a number of themes that run through those different trends, which we can then widen out the conversation just from lesbian fashion much more to cover the LGBTQ plus history, because one of the things that you say very much throughout the book is that trans experiences are irrevocably intertwined with lesbian experiences, and we'll come to that as well. But let's just start with Gentleman Jack, because obviously we're in Bradford. Gentleman Jack down the road, one of not the first, because you talk a lot about Queen Christina of 17th century Sweden in your book, but obviously lots of us will know of Anne Lister as one of the first women who kind of challenged all sorts of norms about women's behaviour, not least because she married Anne, her wife. And she was also a business person, and she had all those minds, didn't she? But loads of us will have. I mean, we've all watched Gentleman Jack on the telly, and I was intrigued to see that question about how much was her clothes in the TV series actually accurate to what we know about Anne Lister. So let's just have a bit of a chat about her.
Definitely. Well, something that's really interesting when looking at Anne Lister, who is she's colloquially known as the first modern lesbian. And she left in her diaries so much about her life, but also her personal experience with clothes. So there's a lot that can be found out about what she was wearing and how she felt about her clothes. For instance, she always wore black in 1817. She wrote that she'd entered into her decision to always wear black, and that was.
And of course,
this
is Georgian Regency time. So I'm in the middle of just rewatching Bridgerton, which of course is that time where everything is so the women are so colourful and so flouncy, and she's
out
wearing
of the
black.
norm, absolutely out of the norm for women. But in the show, in Gentleman Jack, which is kind of the way that most people have encountered the figure of Anne Lister, She was represented in a very kind of similar way to how she will have dressed in real life, but with some modern flourishes, basically, to make that the differences that she did in her dress in real life be legible to a modern viewer. So like the top hat, for instance, that's kind of a clear sign of masculinity when looking at a historical woman, but that's not really something she would have typically worn, but it's an
And what about the
equivalence.
trousers?
Yeah, she wouldn't have been wearing trousers at all. That would have definitely been a step too far. Yeah, because in order for her to still have a respectable position as like a landowner and an entrepreneur and as a upper class woman, she had to have that one last element of kind of femininity, which is the skirt or the dress.
You look so disappointed, Joelle, when you heard that. There's a look of disgust.
Sorry, jogged us. No, it's really interesting to me that, because that's where fashion and oppression is kind of intermingled in a certain way, you know. When did they start wearing?
When did they start wearing trousers?
Yes.
I mean, I think it depends on the person. So many in like the 20s and 30s, a lot of in this interwar period between the two wars, there was more trousers being worn essentially by women and by lesbians, by queer people. But yeah, it depended on what you could get away with.
Yeah.
Like what other privileges you had that let you get away with wearing non-normative things, I suppose.
I mean, because obviously you've got the most fantastic three-piece on.
I'm
Joelle.
obsessed with suits. Really.
Oh yeah. Do you ever wear skirts?
No. Fucking hell. And I don't know why. I mean, I did as a child. I was stuffed into them, you know. But the first thing I could tell you about women's clothes is that it's punitive. Like, clothes shouldn't hurt.
No.
There's so much of women's clothes. I don't know if there are women in the room who wear women's clothes, weirdos. But there is, each to their own. But for me, it's just very restrictive. For clothing that's made for the female body, it didn't seem to fit mine in any way.
Yeah, there's a particular kind of female body that I think some clothes are made for.
Very, very, thin.
Yeah.
But I mean, that we can get into a whole different discussion there about what bodies clothes are made for, can't they? Because I feel like, you know, I'm only 5'1" tall. Apparently, the average woman in Britain's 5'2", and I'm a size 16, right? So, and I just feel like, despite that, most clothes aren't made for the average. Most women's clothes aren't made for the average woman in Britain anyway either. They're cut to completely different sizes, different standards, different expectations.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think there is generally like a problem with a lot of clothes actually fitting female bodies. This is going off the subject quite a bit, but you know, but we do know that different shops, you know, have different ways that they cut clothes. So, for example, if you go to Primark or some of the places that are aimed much more at a younger audience, for example, the distance between the waist and the crotch is going to be a lot shorter because they work on the basis that there's flat stomachs, and of course that makes it quite difficult for people who haven't got them. But Marks and Spencers will cut those longer, putting it bluntly, which is why you end up in a situation where some clothes in some places will fit people better than other, but somewhere along the lines somebody's making decisions about our bodies which isn't necessarily the reality or truth with clothes. I mean, clothes have been important to you, haven't they, Paul, as well?
Yeah, they have, yeah. I mean, my book isn't about clothes necessarily, but I do itemize quite a lot of the outfits I'm wearing at various points in my life because they say so much about who I was or who I was trying to be at that time. Because I think for queer people, well, certainly for gay men like my generation, clothes are a way of letting people know who you were without necessarily broadcasting it to everybody. It was like a code.
Well, I was going to say, because there is that thing, that's particularly back in the 80s, wasn't there, about what clothes you were wearing would denote kind of what kind of bloke you were after as well, and maybe what kind of sex you wanted to have.
Yeah, I didn't realise that when I went out on the scene. I discovered it too late. Sending the wrong messages out there for like 2 years. Oh my God.
Yeah. So it was more than just I like that outfit.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Kind of broadcasting.
I'd see somebody wearing something, and I remember seeing this guy in a nightclub in Heaven on a Wednesday. It was an alternative night, and this guy was there with a leather jacket on with these metal rings hanging from there. I said, what are those? He said, they're cock rings. I went, oh, right. No idea what he's talking about.
I still don't know
Went
what
out
you're
and bought
talking
some
about.
massive ones and hung them from my jacket, not knowing what it meant. He was walking around with these huge cock rings like that. False advertising for like 2 years. No idea what it meant.
Well, you thought they were kind of like just having like a bullet,
Yeah,
bullet
it's
belt
like an
or
adamant
something.
punky sort of fashion
Yeah.
thing, you know. Didn't get it.
Absolutely. Well, that's the thing, isn't it, throughout history, that clothes have said so much. And in your book, Eleanor, you talk a lot about kind of, particularly thinking back into the 19th, the early part of the 20th century.
Yeah.
In Paris, in Berlin, excuse me, particularly, say, like in Berlin, where we had a whole different scene going on, that
Yeah.
clothes were also making statements.
Yeah, so there's so many different interpretations that can come from any number of symbols.
And that was partly so in a world where it wasn't possible to be open, especially for men, because obviously gay male sex was illegal for so many years, that you were able to actually tell other people that you were gay, that was one way of doing it.
One way to go out and do whatever you wanted to do, I guess.
So tell us a bit about what was going on in Paris, because Paris was very much a centre, wasn't
skipped
it?
right over
and then
that.
Paris and also Berlin, because I'm really fascinated by some of the stuff in Berlin, different to Paris, but obviously Berlin prior to 1933 and Hitler coming into power. You know, Berlin was one of the most kind of liberal, open, thriving cities, wasn't it, in terms of of allowing people to express themselves?
Yeah, definitely. And something that I keep bringing up while I've been talking about my book and this research is that allegedly in, I think, 1928 or 29 in Berlin, there were 50 lesbian clubs in the city.
Wow.
Yeah, and there were multiple magazines that were being published about lesbian communities, queer communities, transvestite communities, which was the label that people used. Yeah. And so often fashion would be such an integral part of this. There were articles about what clothes to wear in these magazines. And yeah, there was such a dialogue going on through clothes and through media and all of these things.
And as I say, we'll come back to that as well in a minute. But going back to Paris, so of course 1920s, we all know, you know, post First World War, the skirts started getting shorter. I mean, obviously we know there's a lot of things they say, you know, the skirts get shorter along with the economy, and there's lots of issues about kind of how dress changes depending on socially what's going on and what's happening with economies. But post First World War, suddenly, you know, the very restrictive, corseted, kind of very hourglass figures of the Edwardian era and the bustles and everything, they start to move away. We start to move into that much more straight line, the flapper look, and a lot of that comes from Paris, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And there were in Paris as well, again, another place with thriving queer communities, thriving lesbian communities. It had a nickname of Paris Lesbos. And yeah, this silhouette that we often associate with like flappers of the 1920s was actually also a silhouette that was entirely tied up with the boyish look and
because the women used to strap their breasts and stuff in the 20s.
It was very fashionable to have a very kind of slim silhouette, which obviously has its own baggage as well, but it's very different from that hourglass silhouette, as you mentioned before. And it did mean that people who wanted to dress in a more androgynous or more masculine way were able to do that.
Do you think that the kind of creation of the flapper look and the change of fashions, which was in that kind of 5 years, 10 years from the start of the First World War or the end of the First World War through to the mid-20s, was quite an extreme change of look?
Yeah.
Do you think that the lesbian influence was a big part of that, or was it something that kind of just sat alongside that?
In a way, it kind of sat alongside, and I think that from my perspective and my research, it's like the lesbians were some of the main fans, I suppose, of this fashion and this trend, but they were also in some instances actively moving it along. Like in London, British Vogue from 1922 to 1926, the editor and the fashion editor were a lesbian couple.
Yeah, amazing.
And yeah, they were really spearheading these trends as well in the magazine. So it was a bit of both, really.
Bit sitting alongside it. Paul, is this a good time for you to read a little bit from your book for us? Because clothes, as you were saying there, meant such a lot to you when you first turned up from Wales into London and kind of get into the club scene.
Yeah, I'll read that now then.
Yeah,
so this is the very opening of my book, and I'm 19 years of age, and I'm going to a nightclub called Heaven that some of you may have heard of. The first time I went to Heaven, I never made it through the hallowed doors. I stood outside, chain-smoking furiously, furtively watching the men queuing to get in, looking for someone, anyone, who looked vaguely like me. It was March 1985. I was 19 years old, new to London, a stranger to the gay world I'd only ever glimpsed in pop videos or read about in newspapers. I'd never been to a gay club or even a gay bar before now. I didn't have any gay friends. I had no idea there were such things as gay helplines or gay youth groups. So I stood outside Heaven, feeling much as I'd felt for most of my young life, isolated and alone. Years of emotional insecurity, internalized homophobia, and sexual repression had brought me to this point. I'd survived a childhood marred by abuse and school bullying, had entertained thoughts of suicide, and had very nearly drowned. But then none of that mattered anymore. I'd escaped. I'd left my small town in South Wales and moved to London. Now, finally, I was on the cusp of a new life, a new beginning. A world of possibilities waited for me beyond those doors. All I had to do was step across the threshold. I couldn't do it. I was still a teenager, and a tribal one at that. I'd been a Bowie boy, a post-punk, a new romantic, and an almost goth. What I hadn't been, at least until now, was an out gay man. I'd come to Heaven looking for my tribe, and so far I was failing miserably. On that night in March 1985, I wore heavy eye makeup and had spiky back-combed hair. I looked like the love child of Robert Smith of The Cure and Ian McCulloch of Echo and the Bunnymen.
Oh, what a combination.
Everyone else queuing for the club looked more like members of the Village People, or so it seemed to me at the time. I desperately wanted to belong, but these were not my people. I stood there for over an hour before finally admitting defeat, hot-footing it across Hungerford Bridge to Waterloo and catching the last train home, defeated.
Oh.
But I went back.
You went back.
I wasn't stopped. I went back.
You went back and you found your tribe.
Yeah, and I also found, when you talk about that look from Paris, you know, in the sort of early to mid-80s, that look was very popular in the gay clubs because you'd had Brideshead Revisited, you'd had this sort of the new romantic scene, which sort of, and Bowie, of course, who sort of reworked those images. So you often saw men and women dressing like they come from a different period in time. Yeah. You know, people remember Boy George and the gender benders, but there was also Ronnie, who was the female, who looked much like Joelle now, but with the greased hair and the men's suits, and that was a very popular look in the early to mid 80s on the gay scene.
And you know, I think a lot of that was. I kind of look back now, and I think we were much more accepting in the 80s, actually, about people wearing different clothes. Because I used to be obsessed with David Sylvian, right, which will mean something to some people here. And so I had this hair that, if I backcombed it, had a Mohican, but when it was flat, I walked around in a suit. And looked like David Sylvian, you know, and I think there was a lot more of that where we were just kind of that bit more accepting, weren't we? That we didn't have to stick to what people
part of the
said
playfulness and the experimentation, you know, which I think things have got a little bit more fixed as we've gone on. And somebody mentioned sort of about it being non-conforming clothing. It's a huge part of that. So we had a whole generation, and punk was really about unravelling everything. As a working class movement, and then that led to its own fashion, of course. And we know each other really because we were old punks that became the sort of 80s generation of LGBTQ people. Yeah. So it's this kind of mixing and matching stuff.
Rip it up and start again.
Yeah, absolutely. As Edwyn Collins would say, absolutely. Just kind of doing what we want and trying things out, and you know. And giving things a go, and
it was very exciting because, you know, once you got into that world, you then found that I found that there was this very specifically gay male coded sexualized look as well, and suddenly you wanted to adopt that and look like that because that said something else about you, and you could have went to all these different looks as a young person trying to find one that that felt more like you.
And how long, you know, when you found one that felt like you, how long did you stick with it? Did you stick with it for a long time, or did you go, this is right for now, but maybe 6 months down the line I'm changing?
I was restless, yeah. So I would work that look for like 6 months and then I'd try and do something else.
Yeah. And that was the wonderful thing, was I do think there was a lot less judgment on people. I think clothes are much more conformist now, that there are certain ways that you've got to be with clothes. And I think in those days there was so much, you know, people accepted much more trying different things. That you might have a very different look 6 months.
We didn't really have designer fashion at the start of the 80s. By the end of the 80s, the whole designer-led thing was the main thing, I think. And at the beginning, it wasn't like that. It was much more street fashion. Yeah. You know, you were talking earlier, before we began, about making your own clothes.
Yeah, I used to
going out in them. People did that.
I used to dye sheets in a biscuit tin on the stove from those old dye-on things. In the days before you could stick dye in the washing machine,
tie-dye,
right?
oh my God.
Yeah, and tie-dye and all of that.
Tie-bleaching your jeans.
And then I'd get the sewing machine out and kind of, they were probably dreadful and didn't fit me properly, but, you know, they did the trick for what I needed as a teenager. But I think we did do that sort of stuff and just kind of had a go. Yeah, but maybe it was because we were the post-punk generation that we were able to do it. So you were talking there as well, very much, Paul, about kind of finding your look and the different kind of looks and what that meant in terms of gay men and what it was saying about who you were looking for and what you were after. Your book, you do cover that whole question of kind of butch and femme.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot, don't you?
Yeah, and that's something that I was thinking about as we were just talking now, is the importance of clothes in like the club environment. And in like the mid 20th century, you've got the butch and femme landscape of lesbian bars and lesbian clubs in particular in Europe and North America. And clothes were such an important way of signaling your identity in order to sort of gain entrance into the bar and be accepted by the other patrons there, and also in order to like form relationships or find someone who you would go home with for the night, because there was in many cases a kind of strict code, and in some cases the code of clothing wasn't quite so strict, it wasn't quite so tied to identity, but it was something you did anyway in order to sort of be in this space. And I think that leads through in so many other contexts as well, when it comes to like queer club and nightlife spaces in particular.
And I was really intrigued in the book reading about on that whole question of kind of butch versus femme, which is the phrase you use, the phrases you use in the book, that as we move through the 20th century and we get up to sort of like the 80s and 90s, that some of that you talk about. I'm trying to find the exact phrase that you have in the book. Was it the dyke uniform?
Yeah, that with kind of the rise of, I guess, the women's movement and lesbian feminism and activists in the queer community as a whole, fashion's changed again massively. And in some cases it was a backlash to this butch and femme dichotomy that some lesbian activists in particular saw butch and femme, the masculine and feminine divide in fashion, as being kind of a parody of heterosexual clothing culture, and that wasn't a good thing. But obviously to so many people it was so much more than that. It was never just a parody, it was like a very strong sense of identity and community. But yeah, there was an incredible sort of U-turn into a much more androgynous fashion, which was sometimes known as the androgynous uniform or the dyke uniform, which is very different, made up of sort of,
You're smiling through
I loved it. It's like,
yeah.
You know, so, I mean, there were different dyke uniforms.
Yeah.
It's really interesting, particularly when we talk about butch and femme, because people think about butch and femme and somebody wearing a suit like this as a butch, and then the femme, high femme, looking a little bit more like you'd expect a heterosexual woman to look. But in the 80s and 90s, we wore leathers, all of us.
Yeah.
So we were all just wearing leather jeans and leather shirts, and we were absolutely copying gay men because of that sexualized code. And I guess our project at that time was to give lesbians sexual agency, which we didn't have as either women or, you know, or dykes. So a lot of the clothing we'd wear, you'd think of as fetish wear. I wore a lot of uniforms, like literally getting the bus in a sailor outfit. So.
But the sailor outfit was something that was around in like the 20s.
Yeah.
What
is our is it from the Molly houses, do you think?
I mean, potentially, like sailors are super queer and have been for a long time, you know?
Yeah, there was all, I mean, for gay men, there was also the sort of Tom of Finland and the sort of, sort of pornographic
The
culture, which
clones,
had kind of created this iconography of sexualized men, which went against the popular image of gay men as being effeminate. So you had that going on, and you had the kind of clone culture that I refer to in my reading, village people, you know, people looking like construction workers.
I was going to say, you're
cowboys.
talking about the real sort of muscled up blokes in the tight white
and
t-shirts.
then when the AIDS crisis hit London, I became an AIDS activist with a group called ACT UP, and when that happened, being sort of sexualized was actually a kind of statement about not refusing to be shamed or afraid of your sexuality, because we were being told that our sexuality led to us dying. That was the popular message we were given. So that it was a kind of rejection of all the kind of warnings we were being given at the time. And that whole fetish culture that you talked about, I remember that vividly. I used to go out dressed like that, and I was never into that. What people may think that meant about me, I wasn't into that, but I liked the way it looked, because it was like...
It was sweaty though, wasn't it?
It was defensive.
I remember wearing
not
all
defensive,
gear, it was
fighting
sweaty.
back.
And remember, you joined, you talk a lot about the tribalism of fashion and how we noted each other, and it did make you feel like you were part of this family, this tribe.
Well, while we're on this, let's just briefly talk about T-shirts, because T-shirts get a whole section in your book. But obviously, you were talking there about your AIDS activism, and excuse me, apologies. This is obviously going back a bit, but for those of us who remember, who lived through it, the T-shirts became the way a lot of the time that this activism happened. And obviously a lot of that kicked off with the Silence Equals Death T-shirts that came out of New York and out of ACT UP, didn't they?
Keith Haring, who was part of ACT UP.
Of course, yeah. And then, of course, you move on to the Frankie Says, where, but those slogans on T-shirts became such a powerful tool, didn't they?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, it's a way to have that sort of voice that you can just walk through the streets and you've got a message on you, whether people are going to listen to what you've got to say or not. And it was often a way that people could like paint or use stencils and create an individual message as well on a T-shirt, in a way like you would with carrying a placard to a protest, but you're wearing it, So it's like this constant political message. There's so much overlap between activism and fashion.
And one of the things I hadn't realised till I read it in your book was the fact that until then, really, T-shirts were underwear.
I mean, definitely they started out as basically like how you would have like a white vest as underwear. That was what the T-shirt was, until it became popularized mostly through like Hollywood movies and things like that. So of course that
in itself was an act of rebellion by putting underwear, making it into your clothes. Two other things I want to talk about before we go to questions. The first one is there's a whole bit about Harlem in your book, and I think it's really important because we've obviously been talking in kind of a bit of a UK context there, but there was a whole lesbian fashion movement, wasn't there, in the black community in Harlem, particularly in the 20s and the 30s, and some of that connected around civil rights.
Definitely. I mean, a lot going on in the 20s in general, but yeah, I have a whole chapter on the Harlem Renaissance, all of the kind of creativity that was coming out of Harlem in New York, especially from black queer people and black lesbians at that time, although they weren't really using the word lesbian. There were so many other labels in use, like stud or lady lover was a favorite. But yeah, there was just such a huge sort of community that were having these kind of creative conversations and outputs together, often in the form of like nightlife. Like it was often performances, like male impersonation is something that I look at a lot with figures like Gladys Bentley, who was an incredible black male impersonator.
And in the music halls, the Black Victorian music halls.
Yeah, the male impersonation was going on in so many other contexts as well, which is basically like a proto form of like being a drag king. But yeah, in Harlem in particular, there was such a strong kind of community feeling, and clothes were again another way to express that and communicate. And to rebel as well.
Absolutely. And that nicely takes us on to the other thing I just wanted to touch on before we move on, because, I started off saying, that in the book you kind of say, that trans experiences irrevocably intertwine with lesbian experiences, and that trans and butch experiences have long coexisted.
Yeah.
And you also say, which I think is a really interesting statement, that history cannot forget the present from which it's told. And obviously we're going through a real change in society at the moment, where we're really re-looking and accepting. Let's just talk a little bit about that, because we mentioned Berlin, where they had whole communities that called themselves transvestites, where you really had kind of loads of people dressing in different gender ways, didn't we?
Yeah, and in that section in particular, in the chapter of the book, although there was this thriving lesbian community going on in that context, I specifically focused on the possibility of people who we might now read as transgender lesbians. So people who at the time were calling themselves transvestites because they were dressing in women's clothes, but were sometimes seen socially as being men, but who were in lesbian communities and who were reading these lesbian magazines, going to these lesbian bars. And that can't be removed from the broader culture that was going on, the broader fashion culture that was going on too.
I'm actually taking it back to where we first started. One of the things I think you kind of hint at a little bit in the book is that some people seem to wonder about, if Anne Lister was alive now, would Anne Lister be a lesbian, or would Anne Lister be transgender? Would be a trans?
And that's the thing, is that ultimately, like, these historical figures, people who aren't alive anymore, you can't really say, yes, this person would definitely use this label today, or yes, this person would be this, because we don't know them. Ultimately, we can only kind of look at the evidence that we have and try to understand them, and not like squabble in terms of community about this person's this or this person's that, because they don't belong to anyone. Like, historical figures are just ways for us to kind of understand history and to see ourselves in history as well, I think. But there's room for all kinds of people within that.
So before we move on to questions, Joelle, you were going to do a reading for us as well.
Okay. Oh, let's see. Oh, that's fine. So I'm going to do like a short reading, like a minute poem from Conto and Othered Poems, which is a story of four of my friends, and how we lived and how we died. Well, actually, I'm not dead. Or am I? I'm just going to, without going to any context really, I'm just going to read this poem from one of the main characters, who's called Dudzilly. And Dudzilly, in the next book coming out, which is going to be called Maryville, comes out next year. We meet Dudzilly in 1957, and she's from a wealthy family in South Africa, but has to leave because she's of her sexuality and her identity. And so ends up in London and works as a tailor with her family over here. Tweed understands the idea of her, knows where to press, who to call, how to thread a sheep through a lion, remembers how like a field it is, how like freedom. And the waistcoat, knows when it needs to clench. Her jacket, an elder butch's arm across her shoulders, thinks, is the only way out of woman, man. How can the exit also be the fire? Dudzilly does not get dressed. She unlearns, drapes her ancestors around her, is wearing a suit of ghosts tonight. Look how she shines, how they stand beside her and speak through her. They say, be careful, my mannish daughter, walk backward. The first stone is returning.
Fantastic, thank you. I mean, we have just touched on so many different issues, and there's so much more on all of this we could have talked about, but let's throw it open. Who'd like to kind of ask a question, say something, join in the debate, share some thoughts? There must be someone who wants to kick us off.
Don't be shy.
Yeah, don't be shy. Someone must want to kick us off. Doesn't have to be questions, some thoughts. Yeah, okay, we've got a roving mic. We'll use the mic because then everybody can hear if that's okay. Thank you, it's coming down.
You mentioned about women wearing trousers in the historical age. Well, the first woman who wore trousers who was painted as she was Caroline Lamb in the 1810s. She wore trousers in the portrait at Chatsworth House. The trousers weren't in the portrait, but it's the first time a woman was painted wearing men's clothes who wasn't like a saint like Joan of Arc. And she proudly displayed it. It was commissioned by her uncle, commemorating when she interrupted a party dressed as a page boy in her mid-20s, I think. And she cropped her hair short. She flounced around in men's trousers on horses.
Fantastic.
And there's a lot that goes with that. But yeah, so that portrait is hung at Chatsworth House. And I just think it's a great piece of butch history that's not really talked about.
Did you say she was Charlotte Lamb?
No, Lady Caroline Lamb.
Lady Caroline Lamb. I've never heard
Thank
of
you.
her.
Yeah.
What a great story.
Because a lot of, I mean, we know as Dykes or as LGBT community, but particularly the light aspect, that whenever we see programmes like, you know, Gentleman Jack, it's always the aristocracy.
Oh,
but
yeah.
what were the working class butch? And butch is a working class movement.
Yeah.
So what were we wearing? What were we doing?
I mean, that's always the thing in terms of
Oh,
like the
you know.
evidence.
I feel like I feel
Go.
like if you want to look at working class butchers, you're probably best looking at the female husband movement.
Absolutely.
Because I feel like you were probably going to say that anyway, but female husbands were largely working class. There was only very few examples of upper class female husbands, and they generally dressed as men. And obviously, there is a whole debate of like, would they be considered trans men now? But some of them were just explicitly.
Tell us a bit more about this movement.
Yeah, sorry. So female husbands were basically just women who lived as men. They wore men's clothes. They married women.
What
a
sort
lot
of
of the
time
time.
scale are we talking about?
1800s roughly, but it goes further back. There's examples in 1700s, 1600s, and some people would consider Anne Lister to be a female husband. But yeah, there's like a lot of examples of they would wear men's clothes, they would marry women. They didn't all marry women. Some of them just worked in men's jobs, and that's why, you know, they needed to pass as men because they were widows or they had children to provide for and they needed a job.
So how much is about access, you know, the clothing access to power, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it, that's one of the things that comes up when looking at like these stories where people socially seen as women are dressing in men's clothes, is that there's always the debate of like how much of it is just so that they had more freedom and how much of it is because that's what they wanted to do. And that's kind of the long-standing thing. And I think it just depends on how much evidence you have about a particular person. But thank you for bringing up female husbands, definitely, because that's like a whole area. It's kind of the alternative to that upper class, like people being painted.
I think that is really interesting, and as both of you bringing that up there, and it goes back to something that you were saying as well, Eleanor, which is that because this is a history that is untold, it is edited, it is hidden, we just don't know, do we? We're trying to understand it from now, our perspective now, but we don't have the evidence, do we? We know bits of it, but not enough to...
Yeah, sometimes there just is like kind of a very limited amount of stuff to go on, and you've got to draw your own conclusions. But occasionally there is more, you know, it's just sort of...
Yeah, but that's
luck.
that's interesting. I'm sorry about my ignorance. I've never heard of that before, so it's really good to
I've completely
hear
forgotten
it.
about it as well. That's a shame for us. Slightly
You've what, written a
embarrassing.
book about it?
No. Yes, actually, my new book is all... I'd forgotten about the term as well. There's so much to remember, you know, and so much rich history, even though we don't know the actual details. It's very intriguing to me.
Do we know anything? Is there anything? If we've got female husbands, is there any male wives that we know of a movement in history?
I mean, there was the Molly culture, you know, which has sort of been investigated quite a bit.
Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, the Molly houses were kind of gay bars, stroke brothels, and men would cross-dress, and but we don't know what
sort of time scale are we looking at for
I think
that?
18th century was
Right.
it?
Yeah.
I'm not an expert on that, but there's a book just come out by a guy called A.J. West called Thomas True that's just come out this week, which is set in that world. And there was a wonderful book years ago by a historian called Victor Norton called Mother Clapp's Molly House, because Mother Clapp was the most famous one in London. Yeah, it was a play, absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you know much about Molly houses then? You seem to be no.
Are you our resident Molly expert?
Because you seem to know then. Because we're all joining in now in some sharing information.
Molly means something very different in gay male culture. Now it means ecstasy, usually.
Yeah.
That's hilarious. Never thought about that.
That's because language changes,
Exactly.
doesn't it? It all
Meanings of
changes
words
and
changes.
moves on. Yeah. Who else would like to either educate us or just kind of ask something? Yeah, we've got a question here. Brilliant. And then we'll come over here.
It's sort of linking to what you said about language changing. In terms of the ways that fashion was communicating specific messages or interests, particularly pre kind of internet and pre-connectivity globally, how isolated to specific locations were those messages? Was there the potential for them to mean something entirely different in, say, one place to another, like even to London versus Bradford? Would that distance have an impact, or was it somehow still managing to be fairly universal and well communicated?
That is an interesting
That's a
point.
very good
Yeah, it's a
question.
very good question.
I mean,
We all look
in
at you.
terms of like, I think that there are instances where like some communities will have been like interviewed, for example, like if they were living in the 20s and they were interviewed in the 90s, and you've got these kinds of records where people living in a particular place will go, yes, we all wore this, and other people living in a different city perhaps will be like, no, we didn't do that. So there is kind of that element of codes wouldn't necessarily be universal. And this comes up with things like I guess in the 50s in Buffalo in New York in the US, a group of lesbians, particularly butches, went and got a star tattooed on their wrist as a sign of their identity and affiliation with the community, and that was quite a like localized thing until interviews and like stories about it started coming out, and then it spread a bit more, but at first it was very local. And that also makes me think of things that were codes that were regimented, I guess, because of people's wealth and class. Things like the monocle, which you mentioned earlier, because we saw someone come in with a monocle looking fantastic, which again, going back to like the 1920s and 30s, a huge thing in so many queer cultures, lesbian cultures, was to wear a monocle. But this was also quite a kind of fun, fashionable accessory for upper class women during this period. And a fashion historian called Katrina Rowley interviewed some lesbians about their clothes, about what they were wearing in the interwar period between World Wars I and II. And I think she had 3 respondents. They were all based in Britain. And one of them was upper class and said, yes, we all wore monocles. This was something, of course we did that. That's something that we all did. Like, it was a crucial part of our style. And like 2 of her other respondents were working class lesbians, and they were like, no, we didn't do that. Maybe if you had loads of money. So yeah, things definitely did depend on the community you were in, the place you lived, the class you were part of.
The male equivalent of that would have been the green carnation, with Oscar Wilde, but you wouldn't have seen working class queer men wearing green carnations, I don't think. I think that was very much a kind of rarefied part of the culture.
But the tattoo was a huge part of the way we, certainly in the 80s and 90s, how we communicated with one another. You mentioned like the nautical star, but obviously the anchor, and the violet for women under the watch.
Yeah.
Why is that going? That's going back to the Molly houses again. We're back to sailors.
Tattoos.
But I was thinking as well, I mean, this isn't, just generally in fashion, certainly when I was in the 80s, when I was a teenager, fashions were really different in different cities. Things were...
Well, even now, though, if someone's from Bristol.
Yeah.
Can you tell the difference?
I don't know.
I'm not taking the piss. Like, literally, there's a much more green culture.
Yeah, there is.
And
there is.
that's reflected in their clothing, so it's a little bit more hippie.
Yeah.
And so it's much more sustainable. It's more, whereas in London it's more fuck you, isn't it really?
But yeah, big black. I see lots of media people have all got big black glasses on from London. We had another question over here. Let's move the mic over if that's all right.
Running
Or a
around with the
thought
mic.
or a comment. Don't have to be a question.
I run a lifestyle fetish magazine, and for the past year I've been tracking all of the dyke events that have popped up just in the north of England. And I worked at Dirt Dykes, which is held in Leeds, at Butch Revival, which is held in Manchester.
Well done.
And Diesel Dyke Club, which is also held in Manchester. And all three of them kind of reflect different aspects of like the history of dykes. Like Diesel Dyke Club is just leather dykes, just a sea of leather dykes. There's no one, just leather dykes. You've got like Butch Revival, which is very, very strict dress codes. If you're not dressed as the dress codes that they set out, you don't come in, it's fun, so much fun. And then we've got Dirt Dykes in Leeds, which is for queer people of marginalised genders, and it's kind of just like an array of the whole rainbow. It's absolutely incredible. And when I was interviewing, I interviewed everyone who run the different nights and their thoughts, and everyone in London seems to be saying dyke renaissance, and in the north it seems to be more dyke revolution. So the whole theme of the last edition of the magazine that I created was the dyke revolution is coming. But do you think that the dyke revolution is coming?
Yes.
It's
Listen, I've got some news for you, actually. So my girlfriend's Emily Witham. She organises a big club called Butch Please. So I know the dykes who set up these. Yeah, who set up these proper dykes. Yesterday, she put on the first dyke art market. 2,000 dykes went.
We're selling these t-shirts.
Yeah.
At a dyke market.
Yeah. So basically, they queued. As a community that's supposed to have no kind of economic pull at all, dykes queued for an hour and a half down 4 streets. We were gutted because we both agreed to be here. You know, no offence. But
We couldn't be at the dyke market.
2,000 kind of...
Yeah, you showed me the video of the queue going around the block, and we
insane.
couldn't believe it.
I mean, it's a BBC word, isn't it? The dyke renaissance. And I just keep saying it, but I like revolution better. Yes, I just feel it's like we've been out of favour.
Renaissance feels like we went away.
Yeah. I guess the Renaissance is the way people think about us, not us. You know, so really it's a media renaissance, isn't it?
What's occurring to me, right, and I could be way off here, so tell me if I'm being, but from what I can see of your T-shirt, and I can't see it all, but I was just kind of picking up Northern Soul vibes, right? And that to me is really interesting when you look at, you know, because it's I always assumed Northern Soul was a phrase came from America, but of course it didn't. It actually did mean the north of England, and it was about this underground culture of kind of not the sort of nice, crystal clean wall of sound of Motown, but the other side of Detroit, which was the much more diverse, working class, kind of industrial sound of it. And we took that to heart in the north, and we made it that kind of, I don't want to say, you know, oh, that's the you know, the South doing the way it does. It's kind of smarty, trendy South, and we're doing it a bit more grittily up here. But that, when you were talking then, it did make me wonder about that then, if there's a dyke revolution as opposed to a dyke renaissance, that there's something a bit more gritty and ground about it in the north, but maybe I'm being a bit romantic about it.
I think it's fine to be romantic about it. I think you're probably right, that there's a lot of curating of language in London, particularly amongst all our kind of, well, we're media types, unfortunately. You know, we're artists, but we're a part of that system. So Renaissance is a much more palatable word, I think, in general, than revolution. Revolution is so much better.
Yeah.
What do you reckon?
No, I agree. I think that, you know, revolution feels like we're doing it intentionally.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. It's more active than passive than being observed.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Absolutely.
I am taking that back.
Have we got one last, at the back?
First of all, thank you for everything that you guys have said. It's been very interesting. My question, it's more of a comment. Firstly, I've got 3 comments. Molly House does still exist on Canal Road, but it's neither of what we did mention earlier. So there is a Molly House still in Manchester in the village. My question is, like, when we look at the history of LGBTQ plus fashion, like what we've discussed today, how much of it are we looking at it from a sort of a empirical sense in terms of empire and the effect of it. Because if we kind of go to like the global majority, these sort of people who existed in between sexes outside of how Western world looks at them. If we look at sort of the culture I come from, South Asia, you know, in the 1500s or in the sort of the Mughal Empire, you know, there were men who dressed as women who were allowed in the harem of the women. So there is a whole, and that's a whole topic in itself. So there's a lot of, in terms of the first woman wearing trousers or the first man wearing skirts, how much has like empire or sort of the Western world, because it wasn't criminalized until sort of empire happened in India anyway. And sort of if we go even further back towards sort of Sanskrit and sort of Hindu history, you know, there's gods who turned into goddesses, goddesses who turned into male gods. So there is a lot of rich history that's there if we look at the diversity of it as well. I mean, it's not a question, it's just more of a comment. And in terms of a lot of the history that's written currently, or the little that we have available, is very much looked from a Western or a sort of post-colonial sort of view. And I think there is a lot of more that's there that exists anyway, yeah?
Absolutely. That's such an important point, isn't it?
Yeah, thank you for your for that as a comment. I think that is really important when looking at LGBTQ plus history as a whole, to remember that it's not just the sort of Western European, Northern American, like sort of narrative of almost progression. Like that's not the whole story at all. And obviously that is also true when it comes to fashion and like self-presentation as well. And yeah, like in my work, I wanted to be very clear, like in my introduction, that there's kind of a narrow scope. Like there's only so much evidence that I'm able to collect, but that doesn't mean that that's the whole story. And there's so much more. There's so many more stories in the history of the world, I guess, to be told, and that's work that needs to keep being done, like very intentionally.
Yeah, and I think that is really, really interesting as well. And you were saying that you know the role that empire played then in kind of quashing that and stopping things and imposing that very Victorian British view on societies where things were completely different. Yeah, really, really important to remember that. And also things like a lot of First Nations communities in North America and in Canada and stuff, they had really different views around gender, didn't they? They had much more flexibility around gender, you know, and that's going back years and years and years, and that's kind of been forgotten, that there has been those, you know, communities that have had very different views to the West.
Yeah, definitely.
Go on.
You're gonna
go on. We'll go. Are we all right to go on a few more minutes? Is that okay? Is that okay? Yeah.
Hi. It's a comment or a question for Paul. I'm of a similar generation to you, a gay Asian man, and I found more and more lately there's discrimination placed on me, particularly when I've gone out and attempted to go on the gay scene to gay male clubs. Because I like to wear maybe a baseball cap or army-style combat trousers or trainers. And they're preventing me from going in. They're saying this is against our dress code policy. Now, it's always been our history as gay men to have different tribes and like to wear particular things according to those tribes. Where does this leave me when I'm always being told whenever I go out, you can't come in? And it's happened last night. On a rare occasion I'll go out. I went out last night with my boyfriend, and the staff at the Sun Pub, after 6 years I've not gone back, said, you can't come in, because I was wearing a baseball cap, and it was, you're wearing combats, you're wearing pumps. But everyone else was allowed to go in wearing similar attire.
So it wasn't really about your clothes then?
I believe it's racism, because it's happened wherever I've gone lately in the last sort of like 10 years.
I'm horrified to hear
I was
that.
quite sort of embarrassed to even talk about it, but I think it's very relevant. particularly we're talking about
that
fashion
kind of stuff needs to be challenged.
the
If
identity.
clubs and venues are discriminating against people, that's discrimination.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that has no place on the scene. It should have no place on the scene.
Absolutely. Do you think it could be particularly because the LGBT venues are run particularly by straight white men who are businessmen and dictating
Rainbow
who
capitalism,
can and
isn't
can't
it?
come in? Because I spoke to DJ Ritu last night. I bumped into her. She's like a very famous...
Yeah, I know Ritu.
yeah, and she said it is happening, unfortunately, and they do target certain people.
Bloody hell.
Then we need to tackle it. We need to raise our voices about it within the community, for sure. Absolutely.
I have asked for support of
Is this a
men's
local
groups,
bar?
but I haven't got them.
Is that
Yeah,
is it in
it's the
Bradford?
Sun Pub. It's happened to me 2018 at Gay Pride, where they didn't allow me and a partner of that time in, and it was like, well, you're wearing caps, and then it was like, oh, you're wearing trainers.
There's always
We
a
went and
reason.
got
You're wearing
changed.
trainers like
Yeah.
everyone else in the world.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Even the newsreaders are wearing trainers these days.
Absolutely, absolutely. So where does that leave us if we're being prevented from going to an environment where we want to be with our own orientation?
Feels like there needs to be a mass protest like we used to in the old days. Take like Shirley Bassey rails of different clothes. So you can't come in because of the hat, just get someone else. Just keep doing it. Everybody do the same thing. But I mean, it's racism. It absolutely is shouting out. Particularly in our own community, it's fucking disgusting.
Yeah.
Well, you've got people with quite good voices here.
Thank you.
And access to things. So, yeah,
Right.
something to think about. We're going to have to finish, I think.
Thank you.
Unfortunately.
Thank you.
Because we've run over our time, and they're quite strict at Bradford Literature Festival about not running over the time. So can we just say a massive thank you to our wonderful speakers, to Eleanor, to Joelle, to Paul. Thank you very much.